Mark Rogers TV putting a cap on ACC Media Days as we go to Syracuse and John Casillo from Noon's Magician. And if you want to check out the ACC and Syracuse's statements from the last 2 days in North Carolina, you go to Noon's Magician because John is posting material by the second, it appears. John, how you doing today?
Doing well, Mark.
So let's talk some Syracuse football. Dino Babers with a number of interesting things to say. Maybe not extremely insightful, but at least he puts a spin on things that's a little bit different than most coach speak that we've heard throughout the week from both the ACC and the SEC, where it's nice to be hearing something a little bit fresh and have some new material for football season prep. But it's not been too insightful across the board. But you get Dino Babers at the podium, and he's got a few things to say about his racing car offense, his beautiful quarterback, and your thoughts about what Babers had to say over the last couple of days.
Yeah, I mean, Dino's always entertaining. I think that's what I've appreciated about him, at least covering him for the last, 18 months or so since he took the job. He definitely has a unique perspective. I think he understands that this is a process for him, and that the program that he inherited, was not built for the offense that he was going to run, the defense he was going to run. The talent level and depth really wasn't there. And he's realistic about the expectations that everybody in that room has, for him in that program. But he is a super positive guy. I think he's someone that sees the pieces starting to come together. He's not going to oversell you on what he has on his hands. So I think, right now we're seeing a more subdued Babers and someone who, he tells you like, this is a race car. And he makes comments about, what Dungey can be and what this offense can be. I think that's really smart given, where the fan base is at and everybody's perceptions around the ACC of Syracuse. I think if Syracuse can find a way to get to 6 wins this year, then maybe you see a little more of I wouldn't say, a braggadocious Babers next year, but you see maybe a little more confident, a little more forward thinking, a little more like solid statements versus what if statements from him next year.
So when you've got a quarterback who you consider beautiful, then that's a positive when it comes to ACC Media Day. But when he puts the helmet on, we don't know that, and he's got to go out there and perform. And he's done that, but he needs to stay healthy. He seems to be in a little bit better preparation physically to do that this year.
Yeah, I mean, he put on 20 pounds. Last year he put on about probably 10 before the season. Now you're going to lose some of that weight during the year anyway. If Dungey can stay probably in the 225-ish range, I think he'll be able to take hits better. I think that also goes back, though, to our offensive line. Last year, we had injuries to our seniors on the offensive line. We had a lot of guys kind of cycling in and out. Obviously, you had guys who weren't necessarily conditioned well for the new system and being able to, snap the ball every, 12 to 15 seconds or so. Now, with over a year in the system, I think the offensive line should be better. Last year's injuries actually allowed for a lot of younger guys to get more reps, which should be more experience this year. And then obviously if Dungey can just do a better job of protecting himself, obviously his running ability is what makes him such a threat in this offense and in the ACC. But he's always just got to do a better job. If you're in the open field and you feel like there's defenders bearing down on you, get out of bounds, slide, do what you can to avoid taking those hits, and especially those hits to the head that he's taken quite a few times already.
John, there were comments made about the fast-paced offense needing to be even faster. Was that hyperbole, or is that seriously a goal for this tempo to be even quicker this year?
Babers is pretty serious about it, to be honest. You saw the offense when it was operating at peak efficiency last year was running somewhere between 95 and 105 plays a game. When we weren't running as well, we were running somewhere in the 70 to 80 range. So I think Babers would prefer a consistent 85 to 95 plays a game rather than what we saw last year, those spikes kind of where we went from peaks and valleys and some games where we just executed better than others. So yeah, I fully expect us to be running at a much faster pace this year now with everyone on the team having a year under their belt in the new system.
Now, whether it be yesterday at ACC Media Days or any time during the off-season discussion, do you hear any coaches on either side of the football or players discussing and talking about the offensive efficiency because of the tempo and what that does to the defense if they're not successful.
Yeah, I think the coaches kind of allude to it. Like, you're obviously going to give up more points in this sort of system just because it's going to be more possessions for the opposing offense. I think the defense, I mean, Zaire Franklin was speaking yesterday at the event, and he did seem to allude to a little bit of that, saying, you know, like, the change in system where the old system was slower, the defense would kind of have the onus on them to make stops. And now they still have to make stops, obviously, that's their job, but it's not you need to make a stop every single time you're on the field, because your offense is only going to be able to put up 17 to 20 points. I think that you're hearing more and more that this team is going to continue to recruit defensive backs, because last year that was a huge struggle, and guys who can continually shuffle in and out. And Babers talked about that too, I think, a little bit yesterday, of we need to get as many guys ready to play as possible because of that speed on both ends of the field.
Talking Syracuse football with John Casillo. Please join him at Noon's Magician, the SB Nation platform for Syracuse athletics. He has a ton of coverage on the ACC and Syracuse, of course, as well. Let's look at the recruiting process. Jim Boeheim's name was mentioned at ACC Media Days. He would be a good guy to get on the recruiting trail because of his success down through the years, but different to recruit 105 players to fill up a roster in football. Some recent recruiting news hasn't necessarily been the best. Not that Dino Babers isn't recruiting well and doing the work, but there's always going to be a few guys that turn the wrong direction. So that's been the recent case.
Yeah, I mean, we unfortunately lost between, last year, one of our 3-star defensive ends, Jaquan Nelson, is no longer on the team. And then Mykelti Williams, who was a JUCO transfer, actually was at Notre Dame his freshman year. He won't make it to campus this year, but, on the positive end, we've been able to pick up a few 3-stars on the defensive end. We still have a 4-star center, Tyrone Sampson, out of the Detroit area, who was actually over at the opening finals last month. So we have some solid momentum going in this year's recruiting class, but obviously, that's all well and good until you make sure they're on campus. And it's way far out, so we don't have to necessarily worry about that just yet. But hopefully, the big names that we have so far, I think we have 11 or so for 2018, can make it on campus come next year.
These media days seem to be scheduled earlier and earlier every year. I think the ACC was typically a late July date, now moved to the mid portion of the month. So there's still a few weeks to go until the boys hit the field at the end of July. As we get prepared for fall camp, give us a concern, if you can pinpoint one or two in regards to something that really needs to get addressed in the next 6 weeks versus something that you're confident and really excited to, component of the football team that you're excited and believe is very dependable going into game one.
Sure. I mean, the defensive line's an easy one to point to as a concern. Scott Schaefer's group, going back a few years, used to really rush the passer well. Even if they give up some big gains, they knew how to get to the quarterback. They knew how to stop the run. That kind of diminished over the years, and you saw returns definitely fall quite a bit. I think last year we only had, it was 15 or 16 sacks on the entire year. Given how many snaps we were up against, that's not really something that's sustainable, and it really puts a lot of pressure on your secondary to be able to make stops back there. So I think the defensive line, we have a lot of youth there. On top of, I mentioned Nelson left, Stephen Clark, who was one of our main defensive tackles, unfortunately is no longer with the team due to a blood clot issue. So we're still pretty thin there, and I know it's not the easiest place to recruit to, overall position wise, but also for us in general, getting guys up there. So I think this might be another rougher year over on the line, but maybe better than last year just because so many younger players got experience. As far as positives go, I do feel like the passing game is going to be a positive. Last year, we were a top 10 passing team. I think that's going to be the case again. If Dungey can stay healthy and someone like Steve Ishmael can step up into the big shoes that Amba Atawa left last year, I could see us putting up similar, if not greater numbers in the passing game versus last year, which would be awesome.
There are a few aspects of college football that I don't like. I love the game on the field. I love some of the workings off the field, even though I don't agree with them. They're interesting topics. One would be the bowl process for each individual conference in the landscape of college football in regards to postseason play. So check out John's work on Noon's Magician. One of the highlight pieces is the ACC bowl process. So I'm not going to ask you, John, to take people through it because they can check it out right there. But as you were putting this piece together, what struck you as being maybe some positive aspects of what turned out to be on the field a very big success for the ACC last year, but looking forward to this season, some things that stand out both positively and possibly negatively about the ACC bowl system?
I think the bowl system does create a lot of possibilities. I mean, a lot's changed since the college football playoff era started in general, where you're seeing a bigger emphasis on geography, a bigger emphasis on, avoiding repeat bowl appearances. I mean, the running joke, obviously, for a while was, Pitt and that 3-year stretch of going to Birmingham every year, just because the Big East had terrible tie-ins. There was no real process to avoid those repeats. Now you're seeing more cooperation with the bowl games and the conferences. And really, the conferences should have always had a bigger say in who makes those games and how often they do. Because at the end of the day, if the Outback Bowl every year is Nebraska and LSU, that sounds great for LSU, I guess, but Nebraska, that is a little bit of a trek. You do get a little bit bored of it. It also prevents maybe other teams in the Big Ten from being able to get into that game. And that goes for any of the other bowl games too. So I think this process seems like it caters well to the markets that the ACC wants to be in. And it also encourages, a higher variance of teams. Obviously, that's not going to be the case in the Orange Bowl, where I think you're probably looking at Florida State or Clemson every year for the near future, at least.
Yeah, and bringing up the Big Ten and the SEC have had 2 bowl tie-ins that go back to the early 90s with the Outback Bowl and the Citrus, then Capital One, then Citrus Bowl. And it makes sense that over a course of 25 years, there's going to be a lot of repeats, and there have been between those 2 conferences. And then they added a third about 5 or 6 years ago in the Tax Slayer Bowl, or it was the Gator Bowl at that point. So it's good to see that college football has kind of revamped this across the board, and the conferences have tried to produce some different matchups. I know that the Pac-12 and the SEC rarely ever play in postseason play, so that's been addressed as well. All right, John Casillo from Noon's Magician. Check him out on his SB Nation page, because the preparation for the football season's outstanding, and analysis of the rhetoric at ACC Football Media Days in particular. John, we appreciate the time.
Of course, Mark. Thanks.